Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today's class is on the demise of the Pakistan steel mills. This class is a follow-up to the lean operations class that we had, where we discussed key lean operation concepts. In this is a real life case study of the Pakistan steel mills. And as I take you through the journey of the Pakistan steel mills from its inception to date, you will see that the steel mills have gone through periods where lean operation concepts were being applied and it became a very profitable, well-run operation. And there were other times when, unfortunately, lean operations were concepts were not being applied and what happened after because of that. So we'll go through and see the benefits. And so the reason I usually try to take a case study that ties in well with our theory is that it's one thing to sort of just read the theory. It's another thing to actually see when it's applied in real life, what are the benefits and what are the disadvantages when it's not applied. Okay, so that being said, before I start off on the journey of the steel mills and take you back in time to the 1950s, I do want to mention that this case study is based on an article that was published in Dawn, and I have shared that article with you, and I would strongly suggest that you go through that article yourself as well. Okay, now the background of this Pakistan steel mills. Let's try and understand when the Pakistan steel mills started, and I'm going to take you back in time to the 1950s. And in the 1950s, post-partition, Pakistan was thinking about how it would really get a strong footing economically, and they made a 5-year plan. It's quite a famous 5-year plan. And the idea was to really escalate and shoot up as economically as soon as possible. And one of the things that was decided in this 5-year plan was to build a steel mill for Pakistan. This was something that was a very smart decision. It was the correct decision. If you look at the history of China, Mao Zedong, one of the pioneers of China, when he decided to really change the fate of China and made certain economic changes and decisions, one of the big decisions was to build a huge steel mill in China. And so this is known, it's sort of considered like the backbone of a country, this having a strong steel mill. And the question is why? Well, to answer that question, generally speaking, there is a lot of construction that is done in countries that spurts growth. And during growth periods, you'll see a lot of buildings and construction going on. And so in order to facilitate that and to sort of encourage that, it's very important to have a local steel mill. And with the steel mill, there's a lot of jobs that are generated. It fuels the economy. It requires raw materials, and so overall, there's a very positive impact of having a successful steel mill in a country. So, in 1955 to 1960, that was the 5-year plan in which the steel mill was proposed. And in 1956, Pakistan actually got a proposal from the Soviet Union, USSR, and they basically said that they would be willing to take care and take care of all the technical side of building the steel mill. And they also said that they would be willing to give economic assistance to build the steel mill. And, in 1965, Ayub Khan visited Moscow. And then in 1968, finally, Pakistan Steel Mills Corporation was set up as a public sector company. And so it was officially made a company. And, there was a contract that was signed with the Soviet Union. And soon after that, Bhutto came into power, and he decided that he moved forward with the whole steel mill plan, and the location was decided that it's going to be in Bin Qasim area because it would be very close to the port. And so any raw material that needed to be imported, it would be easy. Also, any excess steel that could be exported, that would also be very easy because it was close to the steel mill. And so a foundation was finally laid for the steel mill. After Bhutto, Ziaul Haq came in and, into power, and he basically found, he also realized the significance of the steel mill, and he said that the steel mill was the greatest and most precious New Year gift to the nation. There were several others, such as General Said Qadir, who declared the mill as a milestone on the road of economic freedom, all around progress and national honor. And so, long story short, a lot of people really felt that this was something that would really help the country in a big, big way. And that was the resounding kind of thought about the steel mill. And a huge, huge area was built in Bin Qasim area, which is a little bit outside of the main city. I would say about an hour, 2 hours away. And so it was almost like a little town was built. Where all the workers would live, and the steel mill, it was considered, would be, they would have their own schools and hospitals, sort of like a whole little city, for the sake of the steel mill. So it started off, the beginnings, you can see, were quite beautiful, and it dates back, close to the period of independence. So where the story starts. Now I'm going to take you all the way to the future, and I'm going to tell you exactly what the current state is. And unfortunately, today, if you go and you have a look at the steel mill, it's quite a sad state of affairs. It's huge. It's still huge. There's 19,000 acres of land, and they have 20 different plants there, thermal power stations, warehouses, conveyor belts, railway tracks. I mean, there's all kinds of machinery over there. And the most unfortunate thing about it is that everything is shut down. And so Pakistan has been we're looking at a period of about a 70-year period time frame. And the fact that it started off in such a great way, it's quite very sad to see its current state. So again, as I was just mentioning, if you go to the steel mill today, you'll see large deposits of iron ore lying in an open yard. You'll see, railway coaches, sort of like a ghost city, iron blasts, and there's generally a smell of gas all around. Now, the steel mill, perhaps one of what's the saddest thing about it is that it has the capacity to produce 1.1 million tons of steel in a year, and yet it's producing zero, zilch, nothing. What you'll also notice over here is one of the key reasons that the steel mill is completely shut is that the gas connection has been cut. And if you try and understand exactly why, the reason is that they weren't able to pay their bill. The steel mill wasn't able to pay their gas bill to Soy Southern Gas, and the bill was for 35 billion rupees. And so SSGC sent a notice and said, look, you better pay your bill, otherwise we'll shut the gas supply down. Unfortunately, they weren't able to pay the bill. And so now, it's been completely shut down. And tomorrow, let's say if there is a decision to start the steel mill all over again, it would take a lot of time and resources to reheat the furnaces. A lot of extra money will have to be poured into it just to start the whole steel mill over again, because it's come to a complete halt, a standstill. And all the equipment is rusted, and it's now, because it's just been standing idle. Obviously, there's we are, Karachi is close to the sea, and so just when you leave anything stationary for a very long period of time, in this temperature, in this environment, it does get very rusty. So unfortunately, that's the current situation of the steel mill. But I'd like to sort of let's take you on a journey to understand exactly, what happened along this journey. Was it always like it started off so good and with all these wonderful intentions? And so what happened? What's the story of the steel mills? And so I will um, take you on this journey of the steel mill. We'll go through it together. So if we look at what happened in terms of production capacity, you'll see over here in this particular slide that the production capacity was up and down, right? So 1999 to 2000 was at 76%, then 86, then 81, 92, 94, and 89. So a little bit up and down. And you know, a couple of statistics that I'm going to throw at you right now, just to show you the amount of fluctuation that the steel mill has gone through. So in 1999 to 2000, the mill made an annual loss of 1.141 billion rupees. And that was, you know, the loss in 1 year. The total accumulated loss, and if you look at the total accumulated loss up to that date, it was 9.326 billion rupees. And then if you look at another time period, you see that, you know, the Pakistan Steel Mill actually had an accumulated profit of 4.866 billion rupees in 2005. So the question is, you know, what was going on? You know, we in the lean operations lecture that, you know, I gave previously to this class, we discussed certain concepts such as uniform scheduling, uniform loading, having a taht rate, and matching your production according to what the demand is in the market. We discussed all these concepts. And you see right up front on this slide that that was not really happening. There were a lot of ups and downs. And that's not good. All right, that's never a good situation. If you notice, if there are these sharp ups and downs, the first thing that comes to mind is that there must have been periods where their inventory was in excess and other periods where there was inventory shortage. Also, what comes to mind is when you have so many fluctuations, there must have been periods of time when you had excess supplies and also periods of time when you were probably short on supplies. So, you know, again, this slide, you can sort of see the variation over here in percentage terms in the amount of production that was happening. So in 1994, it was at 95%, went down to 76, and then, you know, all the way down to 40% in 2009, lower even. 2010, it went down to 36%, then down to 14%, and down to 6%, right? And this was in 2013-14. This was the year when Swiss Southern Gas just decided to shut down the gas supply. And so obviously, you know, after this, it went through an even worse period. And so it was, so this 2005 onwards, I would say it was, here's a mistake, it was more like 0%, right? And so the accumulated losses, unfortunately, you know, really, really bad situation. Okay, so now let's look at it in a different way. Let's look at it this, you know, on a graph over here. And so you see the fluctuations, you know, way up here, 1994, 95% capacity. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And then, you know, you see shifts going up and down, and then all of a sudden there's this downward sort of a shift that's going on from 2006 onwards. And then, you know, then a sudden sharp increase, and then down all the way to zero. And it has remained at zero since then. And so again, this is something that, you know, should not have been happening. And as we go on, we'll sort of be exploring the reasons as to why all of this has happened. So, you know, there were reasons. There was one of the reasons, there was a recession. So there was a global recession that happened in 2006 and all the way to 2008. So perhaps that had some sort of an impact on, you know, the general amount of construction going on in the country. But Other than that, one of the things that unfortunately has plagued the steel mills has been corruption. And so in 2009, the head of the steel mill at that time, Chairman Muin Aftab Sheikh, um, he was um, he was sacked by the prime minister, and the reason was corruption. There were other periods of time again where NAB, FIA did get involved because of the extreme amount of corruption. So that's definitely been one problem that has been seen throughout the journey of the steel mill. Unfortunately, a lot of the top people made a lot of money just for themselves, but they unfortunately they did it through wrong means, and so the steel mill suffered at their expense. Now, there has been throughout the journey of the steel mill a lot of talk about, potentially privatizing the steel mill. And what privatization means is, just selling it to another party, a big party that would come and take over, a private party that would come and take over the entire mill. Something to remember is that this is a government-owned entity, and so when things went really downwards on this particular trend, you can see downwards, let's say 2006 onwards, and so on and so forth. There were many a time that the idea of privatization did come up. And one of the times, if you look over here, 2006 was the time that seemed, this downward trajectory started. And that's actually the time when there was a big movement to sell Pakistan steel mills. And so the selling process went through, and it was being sold at a very cheap price, very, very, very cheap price. But the reason was that the top management of the steel mills felt that they made a very strong case saying that they did not think that this was could become a profitable venture, and they thought that it would be best to just sell it because the government would not be able to continue its operation. But what happened is that the sale was almost finalized. It was all done pretty much. But excuse me, a couple of workers within the steel mills actually went and they went to the Sindh High Court, and they basically made a case saying that the steel mill should not be sold, and it was being sold at a ridiculously cheap price, and this was wrong. And so the court reversed its idea. It reversed the whole bidding process and basically withdrew the bidding process and said that, okay, we will not be, this steel mill will not be sold. So that was a pretty significant event that happened that stopped the privatization. There was another time, and again, we can look at if you look at 2005, this was another period of time where there was talk about privatizing Pakistan steel mills. And again, that did not happen. This time around, it was supposedly going to be privatized to a group of different, a consortium of people that were interested in buying it. And that consortium included the Tuverki group from Saudi Arabia, Arif Habib group, and there was another company from Russia. And so they were interested in selling it. Again, for various reasons, it was considered, that it was being sold at too cheap of a price. And so the privatization process was stopped again. So twice this has been almost private, it was almost privatized, this entity, but then it was stopped from being privatized. All right, so, one thing though, with all of these negative things being said about the steel mill, there was a period of time when the steel mill actually started improving, and the production capacity reached 95%. And, with all the people saying that, just sell it, it's a useless kind of a steel mill, we won't be able to make it profitable. there was a time when there was a gentleman that came around that proved that all the naysayers were wrong, and that the steel mill in itself is actually a very valuable and amazing entity. But the reason that it wasn't being able to, you know, produce steel and really sort of make a mark in the market was that the leadership was really poor. And so this this in this story there is a hero. In my opinion, I would definitely call them the hero of the story. And so this gentleman who came in, who I call this hero again, his name is Sabi Kamro Zaman, and he was a serving lieutenant. And so in 1992, this gentleman, in the midst of all of this up and down of the steel mill, he was given the leadership of the steel mill, and he took over in January 1992, and he immediately started saying, where he could cut costs. And so he just decided to, take out all the wastage that was happening in the organization. Again, lean management. So he decided to start, saving in overtime, in incentives that were being given to employees, medical, transport, financial expense, and all of these various things. He just decided to cut down costs wherever he could. And so within the first 18 months that this gentleman, Mr. Zaman, took over, he brought down the total expenses from 223 million rupees to 165 million rupees per month. I mean, that's, he cut it down a lot, right? We're talking about, good 45 million rupees less expenses per month. And he also started noticing that there were a lot of people who would come in for, workers would come in for, with medical expense bills. They seemed very excessive. And so he started looking into what's going on, and he implemented a couple of rules. I mean, he was not unfair in any way, but he said that, look, if anybody needs more than 5,000 rupees in medical expenses, they needed to come before a committee. And it was interesting because as soon as he implemented this rule, within 2 months, the medical expenses dropped down to 10 million, dropped down to 10 million rupees, all the way from 30 million rupees a month, right? So again, was saving just 20 million rupees right over here in medical expenses, because there was a lot of corruption in the leadership, but also amongst the workers. And so the workers would many times come in with fake bills, and they would try to get extra money from the organization. So Mr. Zaman managed the mills. In 1994, it actually reached the highest level of production capacity at 95%, and the mill was producing 1.04 million tons of steel that year. And so he basically turned around the steel mills. One of the things that he also did was that there were prior to his coming in, there were a lot of Russian engineers that were running the entire steel mill, and they had the end-to-end knowledge. One thing that I will say about the steel mill, the design of the steel mill was an integrated steel mill. And an integrated steel mill is a very tricky situation, because the way an integrated steel mill works is that if there is a problem in even one part of the machinery, the entire steel mill will come to a standstill. So this was something that was a big problem. Anyways, coming back to the story. So the Russian engineers were the ones who had made the steel mill. They had all the technical knowledge, but Mr. Zaman felt that there was no reason that Pakistani engineers couldn't do the job, and he felt that they needed to rise up to the occasion. And so he started testing whether or not Pakistani engineers would be able to do the work, and he was very pleasantly surprised. And so again, he basically sent a lot of the Russian engineers packing home. And then this was another area where a significant amount of costs were saved. Additionally, since this was a government entity, what used to happen is when there was a change in government, there would be workers that would be asked to join the steel mill. For example, if it was a PPP government, there would be a lot of PPP employees hired in the steel mill. In the 1990s, when Mr. Zaman took over, there were a lot of MQM workers um, that were working in at the steel mills. And so there were about 600 labor activists, 15 registered trade unions, and these MQM workers unfortunately just did not work. And at the same time, they felt that they deserved to get their salary on time, regular overtime, all the other benefits, but you know, they just didn't do the work. And something else that was discovered was that there were about 3,800 employees that were listed on the papers and they were getting salaries, but they didn't exist. They were ghost employees. So Mr. Zaman, really went after all of this, and he tried to clean up all of this mess. And this was a very difficult time for him because MQM basically threatened, and at that particular time, MQM was very powerful in Karachi, and they threatened to shut down the mill. And they got so angry. They said, not only will we shut down the mill, we'll also shut down entire Karachi. And so, what happened? The Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Nawaz Sharif, made a phone call to Mr. Zaman and said, "Listen, can you just please just take these people back, these 3,800 people, and all these other people that are ghost employees, are just not working. Can you just, sort of just take them back on the payroll?" And Mr. Zaman basically said he refused to do that. And so that's why I call him a hero of the story, because he did what was right, regardless of the amount of pressure that was on him. And so and I quote Mr. Zaman over here. In Mr. Zaman says, "I stopped all outside interference by labor unions, government, and political parties, and all decisions were made in-house in the interest of Pakistan steel mills and not in the interest of anybody outside." And so this was the kind of leadership that was required. And when Mr. Zaman did take over, you saw, the how the steel mill actually flourished. So, and now, that being said, I think up till this point, I hope you've seen, that there have been, there were periods of time when, for example, Mr. Zaman was there, that it did really well. But there were also periods of time where, in previously I mentioned Mr. Muin, the chairman, was fired because of corruption. And that was unfortunately a very down period for the steel mill. So a lot of these things were going on in terms of the leadership. But if you really look into the reasons that there was such a downward slide after Mr. Zaman left, and subsequently, there are several reasons that are quoted in the article. One of them is, the indecision of governing bodies. And so over here, there were certain situations where when privatization was decided, then the decisions were taken back, then it was decided again, then it was taken back. And so all of this indecision really caused a lot of confusion, and that definitely impacted, the steel mills negatively. The corruption. And so this is perhaps, a very big problem that has been highlighted in the article. And, there was Mr. Moin Aftab was mentioned during his period of time. He was eventually asked to leave, but there were a lot of heavy losses that the company incurred. And so during their period of time, according to NAB, during Muin Aftab and Shibshad Qureshi's time, the steel mill incurred losses of 80 million rupees in 2010, and they were known to have caused the steel mill about 50 million rupees loss in 2009. And so there was, the way they caused this corruption was through manipulation and flotation, illicit spot purchases, inflating the selling prices, importing coal without LCs, high transportation rates. And so there were, this corruption was hidden under the name of all various operations. But net, there was a lot of corruption. So that was the second reason that is quoted for the demise of the steel mill. There are, another thing is there was a violation of steel mill rules. So in many cases, they it was a clear rule that the same company cannot be a trader and a consumer, but in many cases traders were traders and traders cannot buy for registered consumers on behalf of management and sell it as their own product. So in many cases this rule was being broken, right? So the company was trading and they were buying and the goods. So this was not right. Another thing that was mentioned in the case study was that Mr. Zaman's decision to just sort of ask all the engineers to leave all of a sudden. This was something that, was a very drastic measure, and perhaps it would have been good to have some Russian engineers continue and just to sort of so that the handover takeover was a lot smoother. Again, there was a lot of misuse of facilities, the ghost employees, having, employees working in the organization that were not necessarily they weren't really adding value. They weren't experienced in this particular field. Okay. So, um, you know, mm, in many cases, the leadership did feel that it would have been smart to privatize the steel mill, and there were a lot of arguments for this. People such as even Mr. Zaman at certain point felt that it would have been perhaps a good idea, and there were many others. And the reason was that, especially during the downward periods of the steel mill, there were a lot of losses and liabilities that were piling up, and so it was very difficult to also give employees their salaries. A lot of these people were they had their salaries pending for several months, and the big thing was that whoever would actually buy the steel mill would the idea was that they would infuse a lot of money in the organization, and that they would absorb a lot of the employees. They would hopefully help make the help turn around the steel mill and keep it consistently performing well. And so the other thing was that, look, I mean, the steel mill is a government entity, and it basically, when it's not, whatever losses it was incurring was coming out from the government. So the government was paying for the losses for the steel mill. So a lot of people said that it was a good idea, but then again, one has to question whether it really was a good idea, because it is a very valuable asset, and just selling it at a very small price and in a national asset, is that the right decision? And I leave that for you to think about as to whether or not privatization was one of the big solutions and to, to improving the situation. Today, if you actually go to the steel mill, now it's coming full circle back. In the beginning, I spoke about the current situation in steel mill, and I'm going to take you back now to the steel mill. It's a very depressing situation. There are still it's like a ghost town now. There's still some, markets there. It's in poor shape. Some workers that are working there have received, little to no salary. There's a electricity shortage. The healthcare facilities are pretty much non-existent. And so right now it's a very sad sort of a situation. And the raw material is still standing outside the steel mill. There's a lot of raw material piled up, and it's being sold at ridiculously, just at scrap prices. A lot of people are just coming and picking it up and taking it and selling it. And so there's a lot of theft that's happening right now. And so, that's the current situation. And there have been a lot of people that have, these workers who haven't gotten their salaries for a very long time, have done a lot of, they've done protests, they've done all sorts of different, they've tried to reach out to the government on many fronts, but nothing has really happened. Net, if you look at the entire case study and you really you try to understand exactly where the mistakes were, and you apply the lean concepts that we have learned previously in class. I've outlined, 5 basic causes for the demise of the Pakistan steel mill. The first one is variation in production. So, yes, there was a period of time when Mr. Zaman came in and it reached 95% capacity, but unfortunately, it was not sustained. And so, when you have variation in um, production, that causes a lot of problems. It makes level scheduling and uniform loading close to impossible. A variation production leads to inventory builds up and it negatively impacts quality. Also, because of this variation and these changes in leadership and corruption, all of that, there has been a lot of work in process inventory buildup, which basically means a buildup of inventory, which is not raw material, not finished goods, somewhere half-made goods. There are a lot of those, and those raw materials, once that the steel mills has been stopped operating all of a sudden or went through periods of lulls where there's very little operation, very little production. What happened, unfortunately, was that that raw material ended up rotting and rusting, which was a big loss to the steel mill. The third reason, in my opinion, and based on the case study and based on the lean operations concept that we studied, was that there were layout problems in the design of the steel mill. And so, because of this, because of the integrated design, which, as I mentioned earlier, if one machinery stopped working, the entire steel mill would be stopped. This caused a very high setup cost, and the changeover time increased, and because of the integrated design, and there was overall a very high cycle time. There's also very little flexibility in the design of the steel mill, and above all, there was no mention of any standard operating procedures. Had there been standing operating procedures, the whole change and where Pakistani engineers could sort of do the maintenance and take over the steel mill would have been a lot easier, and it would be easier to measure performance and sort of standardize performance so that good performance could be sustained over a longer period of time. Because there were no standard operating procedures, very highly salaried specialists needed to be hired, and this also increased the overall cost to the steel mill. The fourth reason is that there were no checks and balances in place, and there was poor leadership, and there were poor management practices, and there was a lot of corruption. And this corruption was because there were no really good systems in place. And so there was not a lot of transparency, there wasn't a lot of visibility of in general along the supply chain of what was going on. And so corruption became very easy to do. Finally, the last reason for the demise of the steel mill was the lack of ownership by employees. So a lot of the hiring that was done at the steel mills was done according to political party affiliation rather than on employees' competence and skill set. And employees were trying to use illicit ways to make money off of the steel mills by tricking the system. And the medical bill example was a reason, and also that there were many ghost employees. And that brings me to the end of this case study. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you saw how lean application of lean operation concepts can really help either make a company flourish, and if you don't apply the concepts in the right way, it can actually lead to its demise. This is Pakistan Steel Mills one example. There are several other government entities that unfortunately have gone through similar problems. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and thank you for listening.